Good morning, and welcome to our Ruth Bader Ginsburg tribute and annual meeting. We would like to thank all of you for attending, our members, our coalition and community partners, the legal community, and other League of Women Voters of Illinois local leagues. We are delighted you could join us for this inspiring event. On screen, you will soon be seeing our Ruth Bader Ginsburg bookmark. It was designed by our very own league member, Lynn Townsend, to commemorate this event. This bookmark may be purchased for only $5 for non-League of Women Voters of Greater Rockford attendees at our website, lwvgr.org, immediately following this event. League of Women Voters of Greater Rockford members will receive one gratis when they renew their membership or join. They may also order more bookmarks at our website, LWVGR, for $5 per bookmark. They will make excellent gifts. I am purchasing one for each of my granddaughters, my daughters, and daughters-in-law. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce League member Justice Catherine Zinoff to join me. Justice Zinoff will moderate our event. Justice Zinoff has been a member of the Illinois Appellate Court, 2nd District, for over 14 years, having served as presiding justice of that court from 2008 to 2010. Prior to joining the appellate court, Justice Zinoff was elected and served as Chief Judge of the 17th Circuit.
Good morning. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction. It is my pleasure and honor this morning to introduce to you our speaker, William Savitt, a fellow alumnus of Columbia Law School. Mr. Savitt has had an impressive legal career from the start. He was editor-in-chief of the Columbia Law Review and went on to clerk for Justice Ginsburg, whom we are honoring today. Currently, he is co-chair of the litigation department at Wachtell Lipton, Rosen and Katz in New York City. Mr. Savitt's professional recognitions are too numerous to mention in the time we have this morning, but they're listed in your program. They include recognition of one of only 500 leading lawyers in the United States. We are so fortunate to have him with us today to talk about Justice Ginsburg's life and legacy in chambers and beyond. We will also leave time this morning for Mr. Savitt to answer the questions that you have previously submitted. Bill, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for the invitation to visit with you this morning, and thank you, Justice Zinoff, for that very kind introduction. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here, and all the more so when the subject is my old boss, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I note that the title of today's program is a tribute to Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the opportunity to contribute even in a small way to such a tribute is and will always rank at the top of my priority list, my favorite and most important things to do. That's because Justice Ginsburg is my hero, and I expect that that is so for some significant number of you all as well. I say that not just as a guess, but on the basis of recent, admittedly highly anecdotal evidence, but evidence nonetheless. I was recently asked to write an essay on Justice Ginsburg's contributions to a specific area of law, business law, the area of my practice, for the Columbia Law Review. And I began that essay with these words: Ruth Bader Ginsburg is my hero. And when that draft article was circulated to a broad pre-publication review listserv, I was inundated with emails and texts from friends, from strangers, saying, me too, she was my hero too. And that was gratifying. It was a nice surprise, but on reflection, really nothing surprising in it. I say that because to know Justice Ginsburg as a lawyer or as a mentor or as a judge or in any way at all really was to admire her, was to recognize the best of you in her. One can begin, and lawyers often do, with the capacity for legal reasoning, and hers was prodigious. And that's an understatement. She saw the ends of legal problems when the rest of us were squinting to see the very beginnings. She was at the end of the labyrinth when we were trying to see around the next corner. She had resolved not just this case, but the case after it, and the case after that, and the case after that, while we were struggling to get the rule of decision right in the immediate problem directly before us. I won't dwell at great length on the justice's extraordinary legal ability. It oughtn't be a source of question, but one cannot overestimate the extraordinary legal ability of Justice Ginsburg, her truly prodigious analytical capacity. Yet that is only one part of her legacy and probably not the most extraordinary part of it. Tick through the virtues. I invite you to do so: patience, fortitude, compassion, courage, humility, vision, justice, hope. Tick through them all, consider them all, add your own favorites to the list. Anyone remotely familiar with the judge's story, with her achievements, with who she was, with how she made herself, will recognize them all and right away. Go ahead, I invite you to try to identify for me a virtue that she lacked. I doubt you will succeed. I certainly have not found one. And you'll perceive from that you are hearing this morning the perspective of a fan, and unashamedly so. But I do think my fandom, and I think I share this with many others, is rooted in hard fact. No judge and no American, and I'll come back to this, or hope to, over the past generation or more, has contributed more to United States law, or I would say to the advancement of the core principles upon which our country, this republic, was founded, than Justice Ginsburg. And I'll talk briefly about some of those contributions in law, as a judge, as an advocate, as a leader to many. But before turning to such matters, and as another preliminary point, I should add that I am especially pleased that what brings me to visit with you this morning is Columbia Law School. And Justice Enoff made brief reference to this in her introduction. She and I share Columbia as our law school alma mater, and she and I were happily put in touch by folks at the school, I think, as Justice Enoff was considering ways to try to prepare a program such as we have the good fortune to be undertaking this morning. Now, Columbia Law School isn't just a tie that binds Justice Enoff and me, it is also the tie that binds the two of us to Justice Ginsburg, who graduated formally in the class of 1959. And let me make a Columbia Law School story a point of departure this morning, if I might. Justice Ginsburg is a Brooklynite, and a very proud one at that, and a New Yorker, and a very proud one at that. A lifelong New Yorker, I should add, and attached to the city and to her home borough of Brooklyn until the very end of her life. But for all of that, she originally enrolled at the Harvard Law School. You'll have heard of it. It's up near Boston. And after she completed her first 2 years at Harvard, first time living away from home, the justice decided to move to New York City because her husband, Marty Ginsburg, who is a huge part of the story of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, had just graduated and just taken a job in New York City at the Weil Gotshal firm in Manhattan. Now, the good folks at Harvard, and my apologies to any Harvard grads out there, but the rest of us don't get too many opportunities to give you all the business like this, so I'll beg your indulgence. The good folks at Harvard said to Ruth Ginsburg, it would be, I'm quoting from their correspondence, out of the question for the justice to receive a Harvard degree if she took her final classes, her third-year classes at any other institution. It will not surprise you to know that Justice Ginsburg challenged that rule. She put up a fight. She argued that the school, Harvard Law School, awarded full degrees to its transfer students who spent only 2 years at Harvard, and didn't even spend their first year, which is typically understood to be the most rigorous and demanding year of the law school curriculum, away from Cambridge. No luck, however, with the crimson. Harvard Law School was having none of it, would not allow the justice, then just a law student, of course, to receive her degree from Harvard, were she to take her final year elsewhere, even if there were exigent family circumstances that necessitated it, as there were. Fortunately, however, Columbia had no such rule, accepted the justice for her third year with the promise of a degree upon successful completion. And I should say this was unusual because while 2 years is often sufficient to confer a degree, 1 often is not. And for any of those familiar with any part of the justice's story, you'll know that there was extraordinary cynicism, discrimination against women in law school, even as late as the 1950s, indeed, for much longer than that. But Columbia took on Ruth Ginsburg, and the justice graduated in the class, as I say, of 1959. You will not be surprised to know that she graduated tied for first in her class and took her Columbia degree with great pride, no Harvard degree. Sometime later in the 1970s, when Ruth Ginsburg had emerged as a leading constitutional litigator, the Harvard Law School offered her the option to trade in her Columbia degree for a Harvard degree, which offer, the justice said in a speech, she politely declined. I am very proud of my Columbia degree, she said, very grateful for Columbia for its stand with respect to the issues that were facing me, which has the happy ancillary effect of making all the rest of us Columbians equally proud. I should add, as the denouement to this story, that the justice ultimately agreed to accept an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from Harvard in 2011. So she wound up with both degrees, more evidence that one should never, ever, ever bet against Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, by the 1970s, as I mentioned, Justice Ginsburg had emerged as a leading constitutional advocate. Her contributions at the bar, particularly in the conversation of today, the conversation that is influenced by her years on the Supreme Court and her extraordinary celebrity as a leader of the progressive wing of that court, sometimes overshadow her well-deserved fame as an advocate, her well-deserved contributions as an advocate. They cannot be overestimated, and there's a fair argument to be made that her contributions as a lawyer are more substantial than as a judge, substantial though they were. In a series of carefully curated and truly magnificently shaped appeals, the justice, as a lawyer, remade equal protection law generally and the field of women's rights specifically in the 1970s as an advocate before the United States Supreme Court. Those cases, familiar to those interested in the evolution of equal protection law in the United States, the Weinberger case, Frontiero, Reed, challenged the notion of women's work, overthrew the assumption that women should be, or even were, economically dependent on their fathers and then their husbands, rejected categorically the idea that that assumption should have any rooting in law. These were brilliant and compelling early steps in the campaign that the justice waged her whole life, that one's work in the home or outside of it should not be limited by one's gender. She took great care to ensure that the rulings she caused to be uttered by the Supreme Court and other courts announced the principle of equality, liberated everyone, women first, but not just women, from the overhang of gender discrimination as it was rooted in the law. The implications of these decisions brought by Justice Ginsburg reshaped the workplace. They reshaped it immediately. They continue to reshape the workplace. They are today reshaping the C-suite of major corporations. They continue to reshape the boardroom. I spent a lot of my time during my day job litigating matters having to do with corporate governance. And it's Justice Ginsburg's influence that is causing a remarkable shift in corporate governance towards a more inclusive approach. Without Justice Ginsburg's advocacy in front of the Supreme Court a generation or more ago, the growing belief among investors that the negligible number of women on corporate boards is completely unacceptable would still be years away. California's Women on Boards Act recently passed, which mandates female representation amongst the directors of major California corporations. And similar legislation that's percolating in many other states would be aspiration rather than law. This is a very tangible contribution, effect of the contribution of Justice Ginsburg's lifelong commitment to gender equality. And that same uncompromising and analytically unassailable commitment to equality carried through the justice's long career after her career as an advocate, as a judge, first on the circuit court for the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, and then, of course, beginning in 1993 on the United States Supreme Court. I won't use my remarks this morning, which are brief and I hope to be personal as well as analytical, as an occasion to revisit all of her notable decisions. There are far too many, but there are still a few that no tribute to RBG should pass over. So I will pause on a moment on just one or two of them, beginning with the United States against Virginia, the VMI decision. This is the landmark ruling from 1996 in which the Supreme Court, speaking through Justice Ginsburg, ruled that the Virginia Military Institute, VMI, could not continue to operate as a single-sex institution consistent with the equal protection clauses of the 5th and 14th Amendments to our Constitution. It's notable that the justice was given the opportunity to write the decision. She was just a baby justice at the time, only 3 years on the court, but her profile as a voice of equal protection at the bar and as a judge on the circuit court persuaded the senior justices to assign to her a decision that all knew would break new and compelling equal protection ground, and it did. By decisively rejecting in VMI unequal access to elite institutions and the training and networking opportunities that they provide, the VMI case condemned a continuing and pernicious cause of unequal access to opportunity in business to the constitutional scrap heap where it belonged. In the justice's words, women must have equal opportunity to aspire, to achieve, to participate in and contribute to society. That was the unassailable, common sense, and nevertheless precedent-setting lesson of the VMI decision. It took us till 1996 to get there, but get there we did through the voice of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The second case I'll touch on is the Ledbetter decision, Ledbetter against Goodyear Tire, the Goodyear Tire Company, a much later decision. The plaintiff in that case, Lily Ledbetter, discovered that her employer, Goodyear, had for years been paying her far less than her male peers. She found this out just because of an administrative mix-up. I think what happened is she got a letter that was misaddressed to her and realized that her peers were getting paid a lot more than she was, had been for a long time. She sued under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Jury found in Ms. Ledbetter's favor and awarded her thousands and thousands of dollars in back pay along with punitive damages. But the 11th Circuit overturned that decision, and the Supreme Court, by a bare 5-4 majority, affirmed the ruling against Lily Ledbetter, holding that her complaint came too late, holding that she had filed more than 180 days after the events giving rise to the complaint, which the court held under the statute barred the claim. In dissent, Justice Ginsburg pointed out that the decision made little sense. Ledbetter, after all, hadn't even known that she was being discriminated against until long after the 180-day period. She might never have known, but for the administrative mix-up. How could she have been expected to sue within that time, the justice asked. And so in her dissent, she argued that Ledbetter could not reasonably be required to have acted within the 180-day period when the relevant comparative pay information, this is a quote, is often hidden from the employee's view. That is to say, the tribulations of Ms. Ledbetter, though severe to her, were not unique, were not even idiosyncratic. They were a fundamental incident of unfairness in the workplace. There is no doing the justice's dissent justice in a short talk. Frankly, there's no way to give it justice at all. It's worth reading, and I commend it to you. But I will ask you, and this is a rhetorical question, has there ever been a more effective dissent? Not only did the justice dismantle the majority's reasoning, not only did she expose the fundamental inequity of the majority's result, not only did she call out the practical unfairness of the majority decision, but she then drew a map quite close to literally for Congress to fix the majority's error. And she explained why it must do so. Quoting now, "The ball is in your court," she told the legislature, she told Congress. And guess what? Congress promptly righted the wrong and made clear that the statute would be interpreted precisely as Justice Ginsburg had argued that it must, to give practical effect to an equal pay for equal work principle. Congress's confirmation that the issuance of a paycheck reflecting a discriminatory pay decision is itself a discriminatory act was a triumph for equal protection, a triumph for the now enshrined principle of equal pay for equal work. One of the curiosities of Ledbetter, and part of what makes it such an extraordinary story, is that it was a dissent, but it was the rare dissent that ultimately announced the prevailing rule of law. So powerfully, so compellingly did the justice capture the basic, inequitable, and ultimately unconstitutional ground of decision, forcing the congressional branch, the legislative branch, to act. That decision, which effectively achieved the work of a majority decision in a dissent, contributed mightily and properly to Justice Ginsburg's reputation as a powerful and persistent dissenter. And it is true, she was a powerful and persistent dissenter. And later in her life and during the time after she died, when I and my fellow members of Justice Ginsburg's clerk family were in Washington for some of the events marking and mourning her passing, couldn't help but notice so many folks lovingly, admiringly wearing badges, pins, garments that said, "I dissent," or "the great dissenter," to identify Justice Ginsburg. And I suppose that's true, but I did want to pause on this because it is not how I ever saw Ruth Ginsburg. And it's not what I think her lasting legacy will be as a dissenter. Now she never shied away from a dissent. She used the dissent often and powerfully, unflinchingly, I think one can say, and even as a tool of self-consciously moving public opinion when she announced powerful dissents from the bench, as she increasingly did, as she became the spokesperson, the voice for the progressive wing of the court. But at the same time, and this is very important, I think, to understand who Ruth Bader Ginsburg was, she was a tremendous believer in consensus building. She was a tremendous believer in collegial judging. She was deeply committed to the institutional coherence of the Supreme Court. Her dissents were always made with a purpose, a tactical, sometimes a strategic purpose, very often to narrow an adverse holding, as in Ledbetter. Very often to narrow an adverse holding, that is to say, to make a bad result a little bit less bad, to draw the edges off a decision that might otherwise be misinterpreted as going farther than it did by the lower courts, to whom the Supreme Court was giving instruction, or, as in Ledbetter, to leave a trail for legislatures or judges coming in her wake to undo the damage. And she was a master at the dissent. Her dissents were not for show. They were not table banging. They were not to vent. That was not what Ruth Bader Ginsburg was about. Every dissent, as with every majority opinion, was taken with extraordinary analytical precision and with a clear purpose of making the world a better place and the law a clearer and more reliable vessel for fairness. Her dissents, moreover, were always deeply and sincerely respectful, and I invite interested readers to go have a look, and you will, I think, see that that's a fair assessment. Even at her angriest, and do not conclude that Justice Ginsburg, for her enormous civility, was not capable of enormous frustration and anger, but even at her angriest, they were always deeply and sincerely respectful. She was not, with apologies to Mark Zuckerberg, a move fast and break things sort of judge. She was in some important senses conservative in that way, notwithstanding her reputation, many ways accurate as a firebrand, but she was concerned deeply about precedent, concerned deeply about stare decisis, concerned deeply about the rule of law and the need for respect for it, understood both the practical and social and doctrinal importance of incremental reasoning in legal decision-making, about incremental rather than radical progress in the law. It isn't for nothing that Justice Ginsburg was at first an expert in civil procedure, a professor in civil procedure. And for the lawyers in the audience, you'll recognize immediately that civil procedure is our guardrails, essentially. It's a way of structuring what happens in courts and courtrooms and the way judges act and operate and litigants present their cases to ensure fairness and balance. It is a moderating influence procedure is, and there was much in the justice's approach to law that was moderating in that same way. Also relevant, I think, in talking a bit about the justice and her approaches to, particularly to dissents, is to dilate for a minute on her relationship with her colleagues and the importance of collegiality, perhaps worth even a bit more emphasis than normal, given the current environment where there is so much polarity in the legal and political discourse. The Chief Justice, when Justice Ginsburg joined the court, and when I had the good fortune to clerk for her, was William Rehnquist. Ideologically and legally a polar opposite of Justice Ginsburg, but the respect she had for the chief was unbounded as a leader of the court and as someone seeking to create majorities, to build consensus, to fairly assign dissenting opinions. The justice could not have been clearer to her clerks and to the world how much she respected Chief Justice Rehnquist, notwithstanding the ideological divisions between them. Justice Ginsburg was, of course, not the first, but the second female justice on the Supreme Court. The first was Sandra Day O'Connor, again, someone whose approach to legal reasoning and ultimate legal politics were quite different than Justice Ginsburg. But her commitment to Justice O'Connor, their deep friendship as sisters on the court, was extraordinary and among the most deeply held of the commitments and relationships that I saw Justice Ginsburg have. And then, of course, there's her famous friendship with Justice Scalia, which was not for show only. There are pictures, which some of you have no doubt seen, of them riding an elephant together. They loved to go to the opera together. They agreed on close to nothing when it came to judicial reasoning. Bit of an overstatement, but not too much. And on the fundamental issues, very different approaches. And yet it was a relationship that Justice Ginsburg treasured. She valued the virtue of open-mindedness that they inspired. And it made the experience of working at the court for her and for her clerks, who were instructed and obediently followed the instruction to cooperate and listen with open ears and an open mind to the views of other clerks and other justices every day in that building. And that lesson, the one of collegiality, of fighting very hard, but always with respect and an open mind, is one that has powerfully stayed with me from my experience with the justice. Let me turn in the few minutes that remain to talking a bit more about the life in chambers with the justice rather than the justice's public works. And here I hope you'll grant me a bit of an indulgence for a bit of just extemporaneous storytelling. I met Justice Ginsburg when I had the fortune to interview for the clerkship, which I suppose was in 1996. The Supreme Court building, for those of you who haven't had a chance to visit, it's an interesting one. It's a fun place to visit if you're in Washington. Don't fail to visit if you can. It's a very large building, and it's somewhat of a curiosity because there are only really 9 judges who work there, and it's an awfully big building for 9 judges. But of course, there's a lot more to it than that, and the proper way to conceive of it is as the seat of the 3rd branch of government, as one of the 3 branches of government. Each of the justices has their own office, and then there's sort of a bullpen where 2 or 4 of the clerks sit together, usually in relatively close proximity to the justice for whom they serve. Most of the justices sit on the 1st floor, and 2 of their clerks sit with them, and 2 of the clerks sit on the upstairs floors. And at the middle of the year, the clerks swap. So the 2 who are upstairs come downstairs and vice versa. Justice Ginsburg, of course, when she started with the junior justice, she really wanted to be closer with her clerks. And so she did something a little unusual. She took her own office upstairs, which made her the only justice sitting upstairs. The other 8 were downstairs, but all 4 of her clerks were able to be in relatively close proximity to her. And it also just so happened that the justices' offices on the top floor were enormous. I mean, enormous. And I go into the interview, and it's one of the largest offices I've ever seen in my life. And there's a huge desk, and behind it is Justice Ginsburg, who, notwithstanding the astounding stature of her reasoning and legacy, is diminutive in person. And it was inspiring to see the command that this small person had over this huge room, and indeed the atmosphere when one sat down to talk. And we had the chance to visit for an hour plus. I was intimidated beyond description, as I'm sure you can imagine. It was an awkward interview. Justice Ginsburg, and you probably know this if you've seen her speak, was more careful in choosing her words than pretty much anyone you've ever met. And every word said exactly what it was supposed to. One of the functions of that is that she spoke deliberately and with unusual phrasing. And I was instructed by those professors who had known her and others who had clerked for her to be very careful not to interrupt her, because sometimes when you think a sentence is over, it's not. And that turned out to be true. And I learned the art of it when clerking, but it made for an awkward conversation, but an extraordinarily stimulating one, discussing dissenters in history. We talked about the first Justice Harlan. We talked about the French legal system, which was a shared interest of ours, a wide-ranging intellectual conversation. And she offered me the job. And that was one of the most, the happiest and giddiest days of my life. I can say without embarrassment. Started not the next year, but a year after, because I did a clerkship on another court, as is customary, before going to the Supreme Court. By the time I got to the clerkship in Washington, my wife and I had a young family, two boys, one who had just been born under 1 and the other just turning 3. So I commuted from the district to New York. I worked in a small, I had a small apartment close to the court and just worked around the clock 5 days a week, but came back to New York over the weekends. And it will not surprise you to know that Justice Ginsburg was enormously generous in accommodating this, knowing that family can make traditional life arrangements, work arrangements difficult, precisely as she had fought for over the course of her career. Couldn't have been more accommodating in indulging that somewhat unorthodox work style. And she invited me to bring my boys to chambers, which I did, and they had quite a time of it, meeting their co-clerks and the justice, even as very, very tiny kids. And the elder swears to this day that he remembers it. I doubt it, but it's a very nice memory enshrined in pictures. And she couldn't have been more generous there. The way chambers works is funny. You sit in your desk. Usually there was one other clerk in each of the room, and you're writing your opinions or your cert pool memos. When the justice wanted to see you, she would hit the buzzer, and the buzzer was a frightening noise, and it really was a buzzer, and it would scare you up from your reverie immediately and trundle into the office. And the justice was very generous with her clerks in thinking through her decisions, thinking through her bench memos. It was an interesting exercise, because I say generous, even though we were working for her, because it was perfectly clear that she was always 5 steps ahead. She knew what the decision should say. She knew what the bench memo should say. She was so far ahead of us. No matter how we worked, we were behind her. I like to think that we added a little bit of value, or at least company. But Justice Ginsburg didn't need clerks, really, rather more the other way around. I'll say that another funny story, and I think one that is again indicative of how personable the justice could be, was that she indulged the following phenomenon. There's a basketball court on the top floor of the Supreme Court. It had been an unused space, and the legend is that when Byron White, who was a spectacular athlete, I think he won the Heisman Trophy as a football player in Colorado, became a justice, he caused a makeshift basketball court to be put up there, and it's still there. I think it's a terrifically bad for your knees, because it's really just a thin piece of plastic over a concrete floor. But for those of us who are working around the clock, it was a bit of an opportunity to get some exercise. You're only seeing me through Zoom. You are probably thinking that guy doesn't look like much of a basketball player. And you're right, I don't. But I got in the habit of playing pretty much every day, and it was a very great release. But there were always a couple of hours in the afternoon, hour and a half maybe, where I'd be up playing ball, and then I'd take a shower and come back to chambers where I wasn't around. The justice, as you may know, was a notorious night owl, and she liked to come in late and work late. So it was not uncommon that she would buzzer me, and I'd be up playing basketball, and I'd get the message to go in when I came in, and it was dripping wet from the shower. And she didn't, as a courtesy to me, she didn't ask me what was going on, but she asked one of my co-clerks, what does he do every afternoon? And it was explained that I went up to play basketball, and she made it a point of waiting until I was typically back before buzzering me, never saying not to rearrange that habit, which of course I would have gladly done, and was indeed a little bit mortified to find out that she was building her schedule around mine. Yet that is Justice Ginsburg. Another part of her legacy, and I'll continue for just a few more minutes, and I hope I'm not over time, is that after the clerkship, she gave me at least the opportunity to remain close and in her life, which was a great treasure. She had regular reunions for some number of years after I stopped clerking, and she would occasionally call and ask for recommendations for clerks, asked if I had come across any lawyers at the firm where I was working that were good candidates. And every once in a while I gave her one and she accepted them, which was a great source of pride and has contributed, I think, to the sense of continuity in the RBG clerk community. Later, after I clerked for her, as you know, Ruth Ginsburg became a tremendous international celebrity, and she enjoyed that, but she also made use of it, and she recognized that being a public figure who was a small, intellectual, analytically focused woman who had changed the world was an inspiration for many, many, many other women, for little girls, and it was. So her celebrity, I think, was a great source of entertainment, sometimes curiosity for Justice Ginsburg, but it's also, as with everything else, something she used tactically and strategically to advance what was the purpose of her life. And also one saw that in her work as the leader of the progressive wing of the court, which became her lot in the last years of her justiceship, even more on the dissent and in the minority than in the majority. But in every phase of it, as a junior justice, as a senior justice, as a great jurist, as a great advocate, as a mean queen, as she was in towards the end of her life, she was always a patriot. And I use that word advisedly. I know that people don't speak that often of patriotism, but she was a great believer in the United States, in the American project, in this republic, in the promise of this nation, in the Constitution, in the promise of it, in the promise of our law. She was a great American. Ruth Ginsburg was. Ruth Ginsburg was. She, to me, stands in the footsteps and in the line of Lincoln and Martin Luther King. It may seem a stretch, but you will be hard pressed to find anyone who deployed her skills and determination in the historical hand that he or she was dealt to greater or better effect. It was a favorite remark of the justices that in order that women shall be emancipated from their antiquated roles, men must be emancipated as well. Thus, it is human beings that shall be emancipated. This was her life's work as an emancipator. And though that life's work is incomplete, as are all great works, she succeeded grandly, enormously in advancing that agenda through her life in every phase of it. Two final things, and I will close and be delighted to respond to some questions. One is just to read a lovely letter that was found amongst the archives of the Columbia Law School, written by Dean Rosalind Rosenthal, who was the dean of the faculty, assistant dean in the 80s, and then rose in the ranks a little bit later. In 1983, shortly after Justice Ginsburg had left the Columbia Law faculty and become a judge on the DC Circuit. And the letter reads like this: Dear Ruth, when I think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I should come up with something worthy of her impact on American society. Instead, I see her sudden, lovely smile as she dips into my candy jar to fortify herself for the next 8 hours of work. It was exciting to have you at Columbia. You were a role model, a consciousness raiser, an inspiration to students, an inspiration to staff. You made people here think differently about themselves. You paid the price. One after another, your own secretaries quit to go to law school. And that I read to you because it is such a nice vignette of the justice, her modest way, her profound impact on people close to her and far, her winsome smile, the need to fortify herself for another 8 hours of work any time of the day, or night. And this letter recognizing her contributions, recognizing that you want to say about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, what she contributed to society, but you're left to say what a wonderful person she was. And this 30 years before she died last year, 30 years, with 30 years on the bench of trailblazing in front of her at the beginning of her journey as a leading judge. This at the beginning of her journey as a great impactor of the United States and its culture. And already she was recognized as a great contributor. The final thing I'll say is just a brief word about my a visit I had with Justice Ginsburg a few years ago down to Chambers. As I mentioned earlier, I had two boys when by the time I started my clerkship. My wife and I were blessed with a third, a little girl a few years after the clerkship, my daughter, my youngest, and like so many daughters, Ruth Ginsburg became her hero as she began to learn about who Justice Ginsburg and what role she had played. And she very much wanted to visit with the justice. And I can't tell you the mileage I got of knowing Justice Ginsburg personally and being able to get her on the telephone with my daughter. But when the desire to meet Justice Ginsburg reached a fever pitch, I called down to Chambers and the staff arranged for a visit with me and my daughter and Justice Ginsburg. And we took the train down there and spent the night in Washington, went around some of the monuments. And it was after a sitting of the Supreme Court. Justice Ginsburg had us into Chambers. She had by this time moved downstairs. And so it was a different office than the one that I had seen her clerk in. I had seen her judge in when I was a clerk. But the extraordinary thing about this story to me is that I had expected the justice would sit down, meet my daughter, shake her hand, tell a story or two, and then get back to her work, because there was always so much work for her to do. But please believe me when I say she took an hour and a half with me and my daughter. She sat with us in Chambers. She gave my daughter 2 books, including the notorious RBG, with a signature and a nice note. Then, to my astonishment, she gave my daughter a tour of the Supreme Court personally, the courtroom, the buildings, the rest of the establishment, came back and talked some more, asking questions, probing ones about my daughter and what was of importance to her. And she, of course, didn't have to do that. I would have been grateful for 5 minutes of her time, and yet she gave me an hour and a half. My daughter, of course, will never forget it. So will I. It's a story that causes me to tear up every time I say it, because it is an indication of what a great mentor, great friend Ruth Ginsburg was, and what a great person she was, and how grateful I was and am for having had the opportunity to spend time with her, and for having had the opportunity to spend time with you this morning talking about her. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks. And Justice Zinoff, if there are questions that would be good to take and there's time for, would be delighted to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, for these very personal and inspiring remarks. They were just amazing to hear what you had to say this morning. I think we do have time for just a couple of the questions. You really have covered so much of what was in the questions that have been submitted. One is, did Justice Ginsburg wear a white collar every time she was in court? And what is this, or what was the significance of that collar?
It's a great question. And I don't have as much inside information on this as one might think. That's partially because I think the great legends of the collars became much more the stuff of the period of the notorious RBG. And I was lucky enough to be friendly with the justice throughout her life, but I clerked before she was just the best judge in the country. She wasn't yet the notorious RBG. She always had that special collar, and then later she had a dissenting collar. And I understand that there was a rather complex taxonomy of which collar went when and why. And I know that there was a dissent collar. I also know that she took great entertainment, amusement, especially later in her career on the bench, in tailoring the collars to specific decisions. So it's true that she did that. And it's true that she became a judicial style model, but I couldn't tell you anything more about how you can match up the actual collar from the judicial result that followed.
Okay, thank you. What aspect of your relationship with Justice Ginsburg and your clerkship made the greatest and most lasting impact on your life and your career? I know you've talked about so many of her attributes, what you admired, but what have you taken with you from that experience and that relationship?
Thank you for that question. It's a great one, and it's very difficult to boil it down. Spending a year being a junior lawyer with a legal mind, and a generous one at that, like the justices, was an extraordinary experience, which has shaped every part of my career, and I think much of my the person who I am. But I'll say a few things. The first is to emphasize a point that I made a little earlier about the relationship of incremental reasoning and big steps in the law. And as a judge and as an advocate, Justice Ginsburg recognized that it would be impossible to conquer every island. We'd have to leapfrog some, and that one couldn't achieve today an ultimate objective, but one needed to make progress in the moment. This has informed my approach as a lawyer to how to litigate cases, to think about what is persuasive and what is not persuasive, to think about the essential conservatism of the judicial enterprise, even though one might harbor a radical agenda of gender equality, for example, in an era where that was almost unimaginable, and the need to think tactically and strategically. And by that, I mean tactically, how to manage the present case, how to shape the facts in the present case to be persuasive, and strategically, from this perspective, if you want the law in several years to be in a very different place, what's the small different place you want it to be in today? And that was a tremendous lesson. And a narrower thing is this: Justice Ginsburg, I say she's generous, and she was, and she was lovely to be around, but she was a tough boss in all the ways that you want a tough boss. And here's a specific way. You go in and talk with her, and she'd give you the time, she'd listen. You'd say something, and she'd say, why? Now, why is the most natural question to ask when someone makes an assertion of law, but why also feels a little hostile. Why? You have to explain yourself. And what she taught me is, why is a friendly question. You always need to be able to answer the question why. And she taught me this. She never taught it by scolding me. I just learned it because I knew I was going to ask the question why. Don't say something if you can't answer the question why. And it is a simple lesson, but it is remarkable how late in life I learned it. And it is remarkable how late in life people learn. And I say this because I work at a terrific law firm, and we get young lawyers I don't think I could get hired at this law firm at this point. And we get lawyers who are just extraordinarily smart. But I ask the question why, and I get the same quizzical look from some of these younger lawyers that I think the justice probably saw in my face the first time she asked me. So learning the lesson of why, the friendliness of it, the importance of it was a really important lesson that I've taken through and think about on an almost daily basis.
Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time. And so I would like to take the opportunity to personally thank you for your brilliant remarks today, for sharing so much of your personal experience and really your view of her legacy and importance in history. So again, my thanks to you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Justice Ginsburg, and a special thank you to our speaker. The League of Women Voters of Greater Rockford is donating a gift to Mr. Savitt's chosen charity as an appreciation of his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, I would like to invite some other special guests to join me. Annika Vincent from Rock Valley College, where she is completing her associate's degree and will journey to NIU to pursue a law degree with an environmental focus. I did tell her the League of Women Voters of Greater Rockford has an environmental committee, and students can join our league for only $10. I would also like to introduce Jessica Rathbun, a student at Rockford University, majoring in music and theater arts. We are sure we will see her name in lights one day soon. As you can see, They are both wearing Ruth Bader Ginsburg trademark collars. And now they would like to read some quotes of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Annika?
My mother told me to be a lady, and for her, that meant be your own person, be independent. So often in life, things that you regard as an impediment turn out to be great good fortune. Reading is the key that opened doors to many good things in life. Reading helped me shape my dreams, and more reading helped me make my dreams come true. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. Jessica?
I tell law students, if you're going to be a lawyer and just practice your profession, you have to have a skill, very much like a plumber. But if you want to be a true professional, you will do something outside yourself, something that makes life better for people less fortunate than you. When I'm sometimes asked, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And my answer is, when there are 9. People are shocked, but there'd been 9 men and nobody ever raised a question about that. Thank you.
Thank you both for your inspiring contribution to this event. You are proof that our future is in good hands. I would now like to thank my committee for their tireless work to make this event a success. Joining me in this endeavor, Christine Hagerkist, Helen Chung-Hill, Christina Hiltrop, Faye Marcus, Linda Miller, Joan Sage, Patty Stadelman, Sue Thedeen, Lynn Townsend, Diana Walker, and Justice Catherine Zenoff. That concludes the Ruth Bader Ginsburg tribute. I would like to remind attendees that our commemorative bookmark may be purchased at our website, lwvgr.org, for only $5. Thank you for attending. And I would now like to urge all League of Women Voter Greater Rockford members to please continue with our Zoom business meeting after our short break. Thank you all.